Hi, welcome to another episode of the Balance Sheet Breakdown, a Wilkin and Gutton Plan podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the impacts that we've seen with some of the changes to developer responsibility within the Plan Disclosure Act of New Jersey, which really applies to associations specifically that are still under developer control. I'm Frederick, a partner with the firm, and joining me today is Mohammed Salyani, one of the leading partners of our New Jersey CERA practice. Mohammed, thanks for coming on this month.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. And so maybe before we start talking about the new regulations, I think maybe it's important a little bit about some of the old regulations, something obviously our firm has been doing work in the CERA industry for 40 plus years. And so where has developer responsibility been?
So the responsibilities of the developer in what's known as the Planned Real Estate Full Disclosure Act, or as some people know it as PREFDA, right? Previously, there was a phrase that was commonly used, which was known as benefits derived. Now, in these 40 years, or for myself, the 22 years that I've been working here, every time I've asked somebody, what does benefits derived mean? And I've pretty much always received a different answer.
Right. There's no definition. There's no one way to do it.
There's no one way to do it. And in fact, the one phrase that comes to mind is that it was an art, not a science. Yeah. So that's pretty much what the developer would have to pay based on, and what it means is that the developer is getting a benefit while the association is being constructed and while they're selling their units. And so they got to pay for that benefit that they are getting for those unsold units.
So while all the other units that are sold out are paying their standard maintenance assessments, they're saying, hey, the developer's getting the benefit of the snow clearing, of the whatever it may be, the lawn care maintenance. And so there was a more nuanced calculation to identify exactly what the developer's portion of that was.
Right, exactly. So to make it not complicated while the developer was in control, what the basic assumption was that everybody else, as you said, is paying their maintenance fees, and there are what's known as fixed and variable costs.
Okay.
Right? So fixed costs are costs that are incurred. It doesn't matter whether there's one unit sold or all the units are sold, right? Those could be insurance, it could be management fees, like
right.
As you say, it's snow clearing if it's one building,
Yep.
things like
right,
that.
Right. If the roads are there, they're clearing it, whether the houses are built on the roads or not.
Exactly, right. So what the assumption is that the developer would pay for any deficits that are incurred, because those deficits are being incurred for the benefit that those units are getting, and it's the fixed cost for those unsold units, right?
Yeah.
In the past, that's what the developer used to do, would pay that deficit. But also at the same time, if somebody buys a unit from the developer and then that person decides to not pay their maintenance fees, that would not be the developer's responsibility, right? Because non-paying of the fees, it's not up to them.
That's not a benefit to the developer.
Exactly. So delinquencies was not something that was allowed for, right? And usually there would be a budget that's done, known as the public offering statement, which is what goes out to potential buyers. Yep. And normally that is the budget that they would follow throughout the process.
For the whole thing. If it's
for the
5 years to develop, we're going to rely on the budget we made 7 years ago, right? Because you do that public offering statement before you knock the first tree down, put the first shovel in the ground.
Exactly, yeah. Sometimes they would just follow that budget,
yep.
Right? As you know, you got to put money aside for repairing and replacement of the common areas that the association controls, right?
Right.
And then there would be funding of that. And the assumption was that at that time, during developer control, they would follow what's known as the full funding method, which means that you fund everything from zero onwards, right?
Right. In practice, we don't see many legacy associations using that methodology, right? That there really are a number of truly acceptable methodologies for funding that replacement study, but the developers were stuck with what's typically the most expensive.
Right, exactly, at that time. There is what's most common now is known as threshold funding.
Okay.
But that's a whole different conversation.
Right. For a different day.
Yes, absolutely. And then one more thing was the utilization of working capital. So there was no real guideline as to what working capital is what somebody will pay in to become a member of that association. It's a non-refundable fee that's paid into the association. And sometimes some developers would put into these governing documents that they could use it for whatever, and they could use it to offset these deficits, right? The understanding came about that, somebody needs to look at these rules.
Yeah. Right. Just to level the playing field, and the old rules sounds like there was a lot of ambiguity.
Exactly.
That it was, hey, this is how we've done it forever, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Right.
This is how it was done, and conversation with benefits derived. It sounds as though it was a real negotiated back and forth, as opposed to, hey, no, this is the standard says X. This is how it should be done.
Absolutely. What would happen is that once the association went from developer control to unit owner control, they would go through what's known as transition, and as part of transition, they would do these transition audits or transition agreed upon procedure reports.
Okay.
And then that became, as you said, part of that negotiation that happened.
And for some of these associations that take years to build, when we talk about funding replacement funds, if it takes 5 or 7 years to build, all of a sudden, right, the roof of the clubhouse is 5 to 7 years old. How much of the useful life? What's the cost of replacement? And so
exactly,
it really is a process.
It is a huge process. So the Builders Association and then CAI, Community Association Institute, the New Jersey chapter, it's a national organization. The New Jersey chapter, they kind of got together and they said, we need to overhaul these rules. So it makes the process easier, and we need to come up with something that both can agree on.
Fair to me as the what will be the go forward condo owner, and fair to you as the developer.
Right.
Let's just get rid of the ambiguity. These are the rules and regulations. We can agree in that they're kind of split down the middle.
Right.
As opposed to every association having to go through that conversation.
Right. So that's what the plan was. Yes.
So when is this effective for?
So this has been effective now since July 2021.
Okay.
Yeah. So they went through this whole process with what's known as the DCA, the Department of Community Affairs.
Okay.
Yeah. They had both sides worked extremely hard. Within CAI, there is what's known as the Legislative Action Committee, the LAC. And the LAC and members of the LAC, which a lot of them are attorneys, put in a lot of hours to come up with this. And then they had these discussions with the DCA, and they went through the rules and everything. And so finally, in July, these rules were put into effect.
So July 2021, what effect, if any, does that have on the legacy projects that are halfway through development at that point?
So it would not affect anything that's already been registered.
Okay.
So this went into effect for any new projects that are going to be registered after July 2021.
Okay. So, after July 21, I would imagine now is about the first time where we're seeing some of these budgets come back through some of the newer associations that are being audited that apply with the new standard.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the 2022 audit season was the first time we actually saw a couple of these associations that now were registered after July 21 and have had a few sales before December 31st, 2022.
Right, because if, thinking about a timeline, if I'm going to register a project, if I do it the second day, July 2nd, 2021, it's going to take me 6 months to put in the roads and build that first house till I sell it.
Exactly.
That 2022, we're seeing some of our first sales. So while this is maybe not a brand new rule, right, we're a couple years into the rule, we're now really seeing the results of these changes put into practice.
Right, yeah. And then as with everything, sometimes you may sit down and talk about it theoretically and go through all the rules.
Right.
But then once the time comes to really implement it, that's when you realize, okay, some of these things, when you're going in to implement them, may be a little tougher.
Right. It's
some
not as practical as we thought on paper.
Exactly. What's happened is that after the rule went into effect, and now we were seeing, when the developers had to figure out now what is it that we need to pay, they came up with situations where, okay, this might not be as clear. And so a lot of these attorneys and working with the DCA, again, they've come up with some adjustments. These clarifications are kind of in the process right now of being added to the act itself.
Yep.
Right? But in theory, they have been accepted by the DCA to say that, okay, we would accept working with these, these clarifications.
Right. We appreciate the clarification. We understand that that was the spirit and the intent of the regulation, and
right, exactly.
This is the direction we're going. So Mohammed, I think there was about 5 or 6 maybe specific areas that you mentioned. The biggest one being benefits derived, right? So these new associations are not using benefits derived. What sponsors' new obligation based off of?
So, and this is also where some of the ambiguity came up, is that they are responsible for declared units, right? And so now sometimes in an association, you may have registered all the units, right? And they're under the new regulations, they're supposed to pay maintenance fees like everybody else on those registered units, right? So, but if you have them pay for all the registered units, then that's unfair,
right? There's phase 2 and phase 3 that they might have registered that the roads aren't even
exactly. So what now? Maybe if a unit has a permit, right? So now if a unit has a permit, now you know that they are almost at the point where they're breaking ground, right? So now there's basic infrastructure that's in there, right? Now that's for condo associations that are not in just one building, or even homeowner associations that are attached to each other, or maybe single family homes, possibly, things like that. And then with a high-rise building, then that's where they're talking about having them pay fees, but having them pay fees on what's only the fixed costs. Right? Because you don't want them to be paying variable costs when they're not incurring those variable costs, right? So that's where the changes are taking place. The other thing, and we talked about this, the budget.
Instead of once years before you break ground in a POS.
Right. So now what they're talking about is that you have one budget that's in the public offering statement that has been looked at and signed off and gone through the attestation procedures with a CPA firm. But every year now, the developer with the managing agent comes up with an annual budget.
So which is what all of our operating associations have done forever, right?
Right, exactly. They do an annual budget every year. And in that annual budget, now the developer will estimate how many units they're expecting to sell.
Because the POS budget always just had, hey, when this is finally fully done and fully built out, or maybe it's phased in to 25, 50, 75%. But till you get to those points, costs could be double, triple from what we thought they would be when they put the public offering statement together.
Exactly.
Now there's an annual reevaluation.
So now every year at the beginning of the year, developer and management will come together and say, okay, this is how many units we estimate to sell during the year. And based on that, the developer then pays maintenance fees monthly. On those monthly. And he has to pay,
anybody else.
He or she, they have to pay like everybody, like everybody else.
If they're paying like everybody else, what happens when there is a deficit, right? And under the old regulations, 9 out of 10, the sponsor was expected to fully fund that deficit.
Exactly. So now there is a responsibility of the developer to pay deficits, but now you will analyze that deficit, right? And you look into it and say, okay, is this something that was not under the control of anybody, right? Like, for example, snow. As we know, New Jersey's snow removal costs are a crapshoot.
It could be
1
6
year,
inches or 6 feet.
Exactly. Like this last season, we didn't have much,
hardly any.
Right. So if there is a deficit incurred by snow, now what they'll do is they'll go back to everybody. The developer and the unit owners, and they will all pay their proportionate share of that deficit.
It sounds like that's the whole theme of these changes. It's about equality, right?
Exactly.
Making sure that the right people are paying for their obligation.
Right.
As opposed to it being all one or the other, right?
Exactly.
And I think another one you mentioned is working capital, where maybe in the past some sponsors may have been a little bit more liberal with taking advantage of that.
Exactly.
What's maybe the new expectation with working capital?
So the new expectation is that it cannot be used to fund deficits in the normal course of business, or to reduce the developer's responsibility. Right? Working capital can be used for one-off expenses, like, for example, if an association has a clubhouse and they want to put in, and the unit owners who live there, they want to put in something that's not part of the original plan, then they say, okay, we'll use working capital to do this because it's not our responsibility. You want this, we'll put it in for you, we'll use working capital. And if they so choose, they could use it for deficits that are not under the developer's control.
Right? Like that snow excess, where we all contributed to working capital, we're going to use our portion of our funds.
Exactly. It could be done,
Yep.
right?
Okay.
One of the other things that is different that we talked about earlier is, the delinquencies,
Yep.
right? So now the understanding is that delinquencies are part of life, right?
They're not zero.
They're not zero. Then you're always going to have some people out there who just, for some reason, cannot or are not paying their maintenance fees. So now, under the new rules, the annual budget is required to have a 3% delinquency line item in there.
Okay.
Yeah, and that 3% delinquency line item is being charged to everybody, the unit owners and the developer and the sponsor. Yes, exactly.
I think to say that this, again, is a more true real-life approach to the calculation, to the situation, to say, hey, sponsor, we're not going to let you think that that every single person is going to pay every single nickel of maintenance assessments we expect. We don't see it in real life with many other operating associations. And then the other side of it is, hey, if you're a unit owner in this association, this is part of HOA living, right? That there are some, unfortunately, some delinquencies. And so it's not the sponsor's obligation, because when the sponsor's out, you're still going to have these delinquencies.
Right.
This is just
a
cost of doing business.
Yeah, it's a cost of doing business. So in the past also, it shouldn't be settled only on the unit owners, because the developer said, hey, it's not,
you didn't pay.
Exactly. That's not my responsibility. But as you said, it's a cost of doing business. So, and because of that, it's everybody's responsibility, right? And it's interesting that when people buy into an association for the first time, sometimes they don't realize what are these responsibilities of being part of an association.
Right.
You're not a single unit owner. You're like how you used to be when you just owned your own home. Now you're part of a community.
You're part of a group.
You're part of a group. You're part of a community. And if some of you are not paying, then the rest of you have to lift that burden, right? It just comes with the territory.
It's one of the maybe downsides for having access to that way living.
Right, exactly. So the developer also needs to pay their share for this cost of doing business, right? Exactly. So now they've added this 3% in there, and then if it goes above 3%, then it's considered not the developer's responsibility. But until that point in time, it's in there. It's part of that budget.
And I mean, and the association always has remedial courses of action for folks who are delinquent, right? It's not as though people can just stay delinquent forever.
No. They do. I mean, you incur legal costs. You have your attorneys trying to go after them, and then they file liens and on them.
There are some course of actions.
There are courses of action
for the folks who are worse than average.
Yes, that's also part of the change. And then the other thing is that, as we mentioned previously, there was the reserve funding or the replacement funding, full funding now. And as I mentioned, there is a different form of funding called threshold funding. So it is now more acceptable to have that threshold funding done. And also have the study done on a regular basis, have it updated, right? So it needs to be updated, and you can use threshold funding because, if you're funding each item individually, you're never going to replace them all together at once, right? So you're going to have this pool of money that'll just sit there, right? And it's a very, very conservative way of funding, full funding. Right.
Of the three, right? That's the most conservative, most expensive. What you're describing is kind of the middle of the road, a practical approach.
Yes.
Threshold
so basically
funding.
What it is, and giving you a 30-second synopsis, is that what you're doing is that you're looking at the future cash flow, the 30-year cash flow, and you're looking at the dips and the peaks of your cash flow, and you're saying, okay, where the dip is the lowest dip, we're going to take that and bring it to a predetermined threshold. And then say it's not going to go below that. We're not expecting it.
Right.
So you're still keeping a buffer.
Right. You're almost budgeting the dip.
Exactly.
Say, hey,
you're budgeting the dip.
I want to make sure that if there's an emergency, the roofs need to be replaced sooner than we thought.
Right.
We're not at zero.
Right.
That we have that buffer that we can we can react from.
Right. Yeah. So now that threshold is a very acceptable method of funding. Of course, you have to make sure that you're updating that reserve.
I think similarly to how maybe budgets used to have been done, they lived in the public offering statement. That's how replacement studies used to be as well. Hey, they lived in the public offering statement.
Right.
But if you're 5 or 7 years in and developers are finishing phase 2, going to phase 3,
Yeah.
the costs are materially different. And honestly, the remaining useful life may be materially different
Exactly.
than that 7-year-old study.
Right,
You know,
right.
so keeping that updated.
is required. So
Yep.
the standard now is that every 3 to 5 years
Okay.
have it updated, right?
Yeah.
And so we even tell that to associations that
Right,
have
so-
passed their
Right.
developer control and transition.
Right,
Yes.
how important it is to have this stuff, because it's all about having good quality information to make reasonable financial decisions from. And so
Exactly.
why would you not, you would expect the association starting out to have the same access to that information,
Exactly.
the same way that the legacy ones that the recommendations made to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's extremely important.
Yeah. I mean, so Mohammed, it sounds like really the way that the developer responsibilities are determined really was totally flipped. That it really is a more equitable calculation, and it's not just a one-size-take-all. And so I imagine with this, we haven't seen any associations transition out of developer responsibility.
Not yet,
but,
no.
Right, but the hope is that this is going to ease some of that burden, some of that conversation.
Right. And then, but as we said, with everything, as you work through it practically, then you're going to find things that we might need to tweak. Right.
We'll see how the first couple go through, and just like we
Exactly.
had, the discussion of what's considered a unit.
Right.
I'm sure there's going to be similar conversations. My biggest takeaway, it sounds as though the associations and the sponsors are having these conversations more frequently. Right. We're doing budgets more often. We're really evaluating what annual deficits look like. That it's not just hey, we'll wait and see and true up. Years from now.
Absolutely. Because some cases we've had situations where in the past developers had said, okay, we'll just deal with all this at transition because we don't want to give money now.
Right.
We'll give it at that time.
Yep.
But it's detrimental to the association because first of all, they don't have the money.
Right.
Some of them might actually be facing cash flow issues, right? Because of that. And then when the time comes, now they need that money to do those repairs, and the money is not there. And also associations have cash, and when they're collecting it, when they're supposed to collect it, they can invest it and earn back some investment income to offset some of that inflation, right?
It's not fair for the association to fund what used to be the developer's responsibility.
Right.
Now they're saying, no, every year we're going to look at the deficit.
Exactly.
And we'll assess if we need to. Every year we're going to assess and fund the placement fund the way that we all agree to from day one, and make assessments to make sure that that's where it needs to be, and as opposed to waiting.
Yeah, there was one more thing that we actually didn't touch on that I do want to touch on.
Please.
Is that, we talked about deficits, but there is the flip side as well.
All right, if it's a good year, like this year there was no snow, and you have a surplus.
Right, so if you have a surplus, now you've had the developer and the unit owners all pay maintenance fees in, right? And so on the flip side, if there's a surplus, that money could go back to the people who paid it, right?
Okay.
The new regulations said that the unit owners can make that decision, but sometimes it's hard to get unit owners to make that decision. So one of the areas that was a little gray was that, is it possible to have the board, right, make that decision, right? And so it seems like it's possible that that's where they're going, to have the board make that decision and then take that surplus and give it back. And when you're saying giving back, not only giving back to the unit owners, but also the developer.
Right, everybody, same thing. We're talking about everyone's fair share and equality. Everybody gets their refund.
Yes, exactly. So that's, we're still seeing how this is going to play through, as time goes by, and they'll figure out whether this is possible or not, and whose responsibilities are. Because, one of the things you have to think about is that some people buy and sell very quickly.
Right. Then who gets the money back if I've bought or flipped, or if I'm the sponsor and I've sold 12 units throughout the year? How do you identify what my share is?
Right, exactly. So that is one gray area that we still kind of have to deal with. So, but as you said, right, we're still in the beginning.
Right. We've just seen
the first year,
which was a partial year for most, and certainly something to keep an eye on.
Yes. Yeah. So as we go through maybe the next audit season in the beginning of 2024, we'll probably have to deal with some other issues.
Right. Maybe we'll see some surpluses. Maybe we'll see some deficits. It's certainly an evolving process.
Absolutely, it is.
So, I think this brings us to the end of another episode of the Balance Sheet Breakdown. I'm Frederick, helping you make sense of the numbers.